The reeds parted cold and green, and Ray Calloway heard it under the hiss of the current, a woman's voice, barely a breath, saying, "Please." He froze in the boat with the pole halfway raised, water dripping off the tip, his heart suddenly loud in his ears. Somewhere behind him, across 40 yards of open river, Rosie was still barking, hoarse and broken. Ray leaned forward into the cattails and whispered, hands shaking, "Mom, is that you?" Before we go any further, comment down below what part of the world you're listening from and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this one. Now, to understand how Ray Calloway ended up crouched in a boat inside a wall of reeds on a cold October morning, you have to go back 11 days to a Tuesday evening the color of tarnished copper when the sun was setting over Millhaven, and Dorothy Ames stepped off her back porch with a small tin box in her coat pocket and a leash in her hand. Dorothy was 78 years old, thin as a fence post, with hair the color of wood ash and eyes that still worked well enough to read fine print without glasses. She'd lived in the pale yellow house on Sycamore Lane for 51 years. She'd raised her daughter there, buried 2 cats and 1 husband from there, and every morning for the last 4 years she'd sat at the same kitchen window and waited for the coffee to finish and for the ache in her chest to become the ache she could live with, instead of the ache that pinned her to the mattress. Frank Ames had been her husband for 49 years and 11 months. He had died on a Thursday, quietly, in his sleep, in the recliner in the front room, and Dorothy had found him at 6 in the morning, still holding the newspaper in his lap. He'd been a good man. Not a loud one, not a big one, just a good one. The kind who fixed other people's mailboxes without being asked and remembered to bring in the trash cans on windy days. When Frank died, Dorothy stopped doing a lot of things. She stopped going to church because the pew was the wrong shape without him. She stopped driving after dark. She stopped answering the phone before the second ring. But she started doing one thing, and she did it every day for 4 years. She walked the dog. Rosie was a brown and white hound, about 6 years old, with long, soft ears and a nose that was almost never dry. Frank had brought her home from the county shelter as a puppy the year before he passed, and he'd trained her himself with slow patience and a bag of little dried liver treats he'd bought at the feed store. Rosie could sit, stay, come, lie down, roll over and fetch a canvas dummy out of the river. She could also, and this was the part that mattered, read Dorothy's mood like a page from a book. If Dorothy was crying, Rosie put her head in Dorothy's lap. If Dorothy was quiet, Rosie was quiet. If Dorothy was sitting too long in the recliner where Frank had died, Rosie would nose the leash off the hook and drag it across the floor and drop it at her feet. The walk Dorothy took every evening was a short one, down the back steps, across the yard, through the little wooden gate, and along the packed dirt path that wound behind the row of houses on Sycamore Lane. The path ran roughly parallel to the river for a while, then bent north through a stand of oaks, and came back around by the elementary school. It was flat, easy, and lit by street lamps at the school end. Dorothy had walked it thousands of times. But on that Tuesday evening in October, Dorothy did not turn north with the path. She kept going straight, past the bend, past the last of the streetlights, along the narrower footpath that hugged the east bank of the Millhaven River, and eventually dead-ended at a little clearing where a big flat rock stuck out over the water. Frank had proposed to her on that rock in the fall of 1968. He'd been 22, and she'd been 20, and neither of them had any money, and he'd pulled a plain silver band out of his shirt pocket and put it on her hand right there. And she'd cried so hard she couldn't answer for almost a full minute. Dorothy had not walked to that rock since Frank died. She had wanted to, she had planned to, she had more than once put her coat on and stood at the back door with Rosie leashed and ready, and then she had turned around and taken her coat off and gone to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea, because the rock was a place she was afraid of visiting alone. In the tin box in her pocket that evening was Frank's wedding band. He had lost weight at the end, and the ring had slipped off his finger the last week of his life, and he had told her, in a joking voice that hadn't been quite a joke, "Dorothy, put that in the river for me one day, would you? I'd like to leave a piece of me somewhere pretty." She had promised she would. She hadn't done it. 4 years had gone by, and she hadn't done it. But that October morning she had woken up and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and understood, in the way you understand a thing without needing to say it out loud, that she was 78 years old and she was not going to live forever. And if she didn't take that ring to the river soon, she was going to die with it in a jewelry box, and Frank would still be waiting. So she had put on her coat. She had clipped the leash to Rosie's collar, and at dusk, with the sky turning purple and the wind starting to come up off the water, she had walked past the bend and down the narrower path toward the flat rock, where a boy named Frank had once given her a silver ring. Dorothy never made it to the rock. 10 feet before the clearing, the path narrowed to almost nothing where the bank had crumbled in the spring floods. There was a shelf of clay maybe 18 inches wide, and past that, a 6-foot drop straight down to a pocket of the river where the current ran slow and shallow and full of cattails. Dorothy had known about the crumbled shelf. She had seen it years ago before Frank died, when the two of them still walked out to the rock on Sunday afternoons. But her memory had softened it in her mind. She thought of it as a place you had to be careful, not a place that could kill you. She was careful. She held Rosie's leash tight and put her right hand against the trunk of a slim young sycamore and tested the clay with the toe of her boot. It felt firm. She took a step. The clay held. She took another step, and the whole shelf gave way under her at once, the way a shelf of packed dirt gives when it's been eaten out from underneath by 6 months of hidden water, and Dorothy went down. She did not fall far in terms of feet, but she fell hard. Her left side hit a knee of exposed root on the way down, and she felt something crack in her ribs and heard herself grunt in a small, startled voice. She landed on her back in about 8 inches of cold water, with her legs wedged between the clay bank and a submerged log the size of a telephone pole. The leash was torn from her hand. For a long time she didn't move. Her chest hurt so badly that she couldn't take a full breath, and every shallow breath made a whistling sound in her throat that scared her. The sky above her was going from purple to black very quickly. Somewhere up on the bank, Rosie was making a high, frantic sound Dorothy had never heard her make before, a whining wail that kept catching in the dog's throat. "Rosie," Dorothy whispered. "Rosie, honey, go home. Go get somebody." Rosie did not go home. Rosie ran back and forth along the top of the bank, whining, and then she tried to come down after Dorothy. She skidded halfway down the 6-foot drop on her belly, scrabbled at the clay, and only just managed to claw her way back up. She stood at the edge and cried. Dorothy tried, weakly, to move her legs. She could not. The submerged log had trapped her thigh at an angle she could not work around, and the current, though slow, was steady enough to keep pressing her back into the clay every time she tried to twist. She reached for the little tin box in her pocket to make sure it was still there. It was. Her cold fingers closed around it like it was the last real thing in the world. "Rosie," she said again, louder. "Go home. Get Marge. Get somebody." Rosie stared down at her, ears flat, and Dorothy realized in a horrible, slow way that she had never actually taught Rosie, "Go home." Frank had taught her, "Sit and stay," and "Fetch the dummy." He had not taught her, "Go, get help." That was something dogs only did in television movies. The temperature dropped. The last of the light bled out of the sky. Rosie stayed at the top of the bank, whining, and then, when whining did nothing, she began to bark. Long, hollow, aimed barks that carried across the water in a way whining did not. She barked at the far shore, because on the far shore was a bike path that people sometimes walked, and somewhere in her dog brain she must have understood that people were the only thing that could help. That was the first night. Ray Calloway was 63 years old and lived alone in a brown shingled cottage on the west side of the river, about a quarter-mile downstream from the flat rock. He had worked for the electric company for 41 years, mostly climbing poles and pulling wire, and he had retired the year before with a bad shoulder and a decent pension and no idea what to do with himself. His wife, Nora, had left him in 1992 after 8 years of marriage and no children, and he had never remarried. He had a dog, a black lab named Buddy, who had died in April. Buddy had been 13 years old and had gone downhill in the way old labs do, all at once. 1 week fine, and the next week not. Ray had held him on the exam room floor at the vet's office while the vet slipped the needle in. Then he had gone home and sat in the kitchen for 4 hours without turning any lights on, and after that, he'd started fishing every morning because if he stayed in the house past sunrise, the quiet in the kitchen was going to break him. Ray fished the east bank because the west bank behind his cottage was too weedy. Every morning at about 5:30, he'd walk his tackle box and his rod down to the county access, cross the little wooden footbridge over the culvert, and hike about half a mile north to a bend in the river where the smallmouth bass liked to hold in the shadow of a fallen willow. He'd fish for 2 hours, catch 2 or 3, put them back, and hike home in time to make eggs. He heard Rosie for the first time on the morning after Dorothy fell. It was Wednesday, and the sun wasn't quite up. Ray was walking north along the east bank with his rod on his shoulder and his coffee thermos in his free hand when the barking started somewhere behind him. He turned his head. About 40 yards back the way he'd come, a brown and white hound was standing in the mud at the edge of the water, muzzle pointed across the river, barking in long, steady bursts that sounded like she was trying to talk to something. Ray watched her for a couple of seconds. She barked, waited. He shrugged. Some hound after muskrats, probably. There were muskrats in the reeds all along that stretch. Rosie was a hound. Hounds barked. Ray kept walking. He would think about that moment later. He would think about it for the rest of his life. Behind him, Rosie went on barking until the sun came up and the mist lifted off the water, and then she trotted 1.5 miles back to the pale yellow house on Sycamore Lane, sat down at the back door, and cried until her voice gave out. She stayed there through the middle of the day. Nobody came to the door because nobody knew to come. Dorothy Ames lived alone. Her nearest neighbor, Marge Whitcomb, had gone to see her sister in Ohio for 2 weeks and had left on the previous Sunday. That afternoon, Rosie stood up, shook herself, and walked back to the river. Dorothy was still in the pocket of the bank. She had lost feeling in her legs sometime in the night. Her ribs hurt with every breath. The cold water had risen slightly with the morning tide of runoff, and now it was up to just under her armpits. She was leaning her head back against the clay to keep her mouth above water. She had drifted in and out of a strange, thin sleep all morning, and every time she woke, she felt heavier and slower and less afraid. And she understood, in the small, clear part of her mind that was still awake, that not being afraid was the worst sign of all. When Rosie appeared at the top of the bank, Dorothy started to cry. "Rosie," she said. Good girl. Go find somebody, Rosie." Rosie licked her muzzle, whined once, and then trotted the length of the bank, stopped, and started barking at the far shore again. Dorothy realized what the dog was doing. Rosie could not get down to her. Rosie could not fetch a person from the empty houses on Sycamore Lane, but across the water, 40 yards away, was the fisherman's path where a man with a rod sometimes walked. Rosie had watched Dorothy watch that man for years. Rosie was calling him. "Good girl," Dorothy whispered. "Good girl." She would say it 1,000 times over the next 4 days. That night the temperature dropped into the low 40s. Dorothy took her right arm out of the water and put it in the pocket of her coat and closed her cold fingers around the tin box. She thought about Frank. She thought about how he used to warm her feet under the blanket when she couldn't sleep. She thought about her daughter Susan and about the phone call she had not made. Susan lived in Richmond, 6 hours away, and had 2 teenagers and a husband and a job at a bank, and Dorothy had not wanted to worry her about the trip to the Rock. She had planned to call after. "Susan, honey, I did it. I took your father's ring to the river." Nobody knew where Dorothy Ames was. On Thursday morning, the second full morning after Dorothy fell, Ray Calloway walked north up the east bank of the river with his rod on his shoulder and his thermos in his hand, and Rosie was standing in exactly the same spot as the day before, barking in exactly the same rhythm at exactly the same tangle of cattails on the opposite shore. Ray slowed down when he saw her. That was interesting, he thought, that she'd come back. Then he decided it wasn't that interesting, because dogs came back. He'd known dogs that came back to the same corner of the same yard every day for years to bark at a squirrel that lived in the same tree. Rosie was probably one of those dogs. He walked past her. 50 feet up the bank he stopped. He didn't know why he stopped. He turned around and looked at Rosie again. The dog was pointed at one specific spot in the reeds. She wasn't scanning. She wasn't turning her head. Her tail wasn't wagging. She was frozen in a stance Ray had seen before, on hunting dogs pointing at a downed bird, on retrievers marking a fall. She was pointing. Ray felt something small and uneasy move in his stomach. Then he pushed it down. He was tired and old, and his shoulder hurt, and he was probably imagining things. Dogs pointed at all kinds of nothing. He walked on. At his fishing spot, he cast 3 times and caught nothing. His hands were unsteady. He kept looking back down the bank at the dog. Even at that distance, he could hear the barks, hoarser now than the morning before, cracking a little in the middle. After a while, he reeled in and walked home the long way over the road bridge so he wouldn't have to pass her. He did not sleep well that night. On Friday morning, Ray put on his coat and got as far as his own back door, and then turned around and went back to bed. He told himself his shoulder was acting up. He told himself the fish weren't biting anyway. He told himself a lot of things. What he did not tell himself was that he did not want to walk past that dog and hear her voice again, because it reminded him of Buddy in April, of the sound Buddy had made in the last week when he couldn't get up off the kitchen floor. Ray Calloway had spent his whole life avoiding things that hurt. He had avoided Nora's phone calls after the divorce. He had avoided his own brother's funeral. He had avoided the vet's office for 6 months while Buddy went downhill. And now he was avoiding a dog on a riverbank. On Sycamore Lane, the mail was piling up in the little metal box on Dorothy Ames's front porch. On Friday morning, the substitute mail carrier, a young man filling in for 2 weeks while the regular carrier had knee surgery, noticed the pile and shrugged. Older people went places. Sometimes they forgot to hold the mail. He kept stuffing it in until the box wouldn't shut. On Friday afternoon, Doris Cutler from 3 houses down noticed that Dorothy's car hadn't moved from the driveway in 3 days. Doris was 71 and lived with her husband Bob, and she was not close to Dorothy, but she was not cold to her either. She stood on her porch with her hand on her hip and looked at the pale yellow house and thought about walking over there. Then she thought maybe Dorothy had gone to Richmond to see Susan. Dorothy sometimes went to Richmond. Doris went back inside. That evening, Doris did think to call Susan Ames Rutledge, Dorothy's daughter, on the number written in the church directory that had been sitting on Doris's kitchen counter for 8 years. But Doris couldn't find her reading glasses, and she thought she'd do it in the morning, and she forgot. On Saturday morning, Rosie was in her spot again. She had gone home for water sometime in the night, but not for long, because the water in her bowl in the yard was low and she was rationing it. She was thinner than she had been on Tuesday. Her ribs showed a little through her coat. Her voice was so rough now that the barks came out cracked, like the sound of a pull cord starting on an old lawnmower. Ray Calloway went fishing on Saturday. He couldn't stand not going. He walked the long way around, over the road bridge, and he came up the east bank from the north instead of the south, so he wouldn't have to pass Rosie on his way to his spot. He fished for an hour without a bite. Then he heard the barking start again downriver, hoarse and ragged, and he could not stand it any more. He reeled in and walked south, back toward Rosie, and he stopped 40 feet from her, and stood on the bank with his rod in his hand and watched her. She barked. She waited. She barked. She waited. She did not look at Ray. She did not glance at him. She was locked on that one spot in the cattails on the far shore, the way a hunting dog locks on a downed bird when the retrieve is the only thing in the world. Ray felt his stomach go cold. "Hey," he said softly, more to himself than to the dog. "Hey, girl." Rosie did not turn her head. She barked. She waited. Ray thought about wading in. The river at that point was too deep to wade, chest deep in the channel and full of holes, and the water in October was cold enough to seize a man's legs in 10 minutes. He didn't have a boat. His neighbor Wendell had a boat. He walked home. He didn't hurry, exactly, but he didn't dawdle either. He crossed the bridge and cut through his own backyard and walked 3 doors down to Wendell Pierce's place. Wendell was outside stacking firewood. "Wendell," Ray said, and then he stopped, because he didn't know what he wanted to say. "Ray," Wendell said. He waited. "You got that little aluminum boat still?" Ray asked. "Sure do," Wendell said. "You want to borrow it?" "I want to buy the use of it for an hour." Wendell squinted at him. "You in some kind of trouble, Ray?" "I don't know," Ray said. "I got a bad feeling about something." Wendell was a man who took bad feelings seriously. He put down the piece of firewood in his hand, wiped his palms on his jeans, and walked with Ray around to the side yard where the boat sat on a little dolly. The motor was a 5-horse Evinrude that hadn't run since August. Wendell primed it, pulled it 3 times, and it caught. He handed Ray a paddle. "You want me to come?" Wendell said. Ray thought about it. "No," he said. "No, I'll go. It might be nothing." Wendell nodded slowly. "Take my radio," he said, and handed over a little handheld VHF. "You holler, I'll come." Ray put the boat on his trailer, hooked it to his truck, and drove down to the county access. It was a 10-minute drive. When he pulled into the gravel lot, Rosie was still barking. He could hear her from the parking area. Her voice sounded like something dying. He backed the trailer down the ramp, and the boat floated free. He climbed in. He started the motor. He pointed the nose upstream and gave it just enough throttle to hold against the current, and he moved north along the east bank, past the fallen willow where the smallmouth held, past the bend, until he could see the muddy patch where Rosie stood. He cut the motor and let the boat drift. Rosie saw him. For the first time in 4 days, her stance broke. She stopped barking. She stared at him. Then she started barking again, but this time her whole body was moving with it, her front feet coming up off the mud, her tail whipping, her muzzle jabbing toward the cattails on the far shore, like she was trying to physically throw the sound at them. "I see you," Ray said. "I see you, girl." He turned the nose of the boat toward the cattails. He gave the motor a little gas. The current caught him and pushed him sideways twice before he corrected, and then he was moving across the river toward the reeds. And Rosie was silent on the bank behind him, watching. The cattails came up on him faster than he expected. They were tall, taller than the boat, and they closed around the aluminum hull with a soft, dry rustling that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The air inside the reeds was colder than the air outside them, and it smelled of wet clay and rotting leaves. Ray killed the motor and let the boat glide. He could not see the shore. He could not see the sky. He could see nothing but green reeds and brown water and the pale bloom of his own breath. He almost turned back. He almost put the motor in reverse and backed out of the cattails and told himself the dog was crazy and Wendell would laugh at him. And Dorothy Ames, wherever she was, would come home on Monday from Richmond with a story about her grandkids. Then he heard it. A sound so small he could have been imagining it. Under the hiss of the current, under the whisper of the reeds against the boat, a woman's voice, barely a breath. "Please." Ray Calloway sat very still. "Ma'am," he whispered. "Ma'am, is that you?" "Please," the voice said. Ray reached out with his paddle and pushed the boat forward through the reeds. The cattails parted grudgingly. He came around a little bend of the bank, and there she was. Dorothy Ames, wedged between the clay and the submerged log, water up to her armpits, her face grey, her lips blue, her right hand up above the water and clenched around a small metal box, her eyes half open and fixed on nothing. For a second, Ray couldn't move. His whole body locked up the way it had locked up in the vet's office when Buddy stopped breathing. Then he shook himself hard, threw his paddle into the boat, and reached for her. "Mom," he said. "Mom, my name is Ray. I got you. I got you, Mom." Dorothy's eyes moved. They did not focus on him, but they moved. "Rosie," she whispered. "Rosie's up on the bank," Ray said. "She's fine. She's the one who brought me. Ma'am, I'm going to get a rope on you, all right? I'm going to have to move you a little, and it's going to hurt." "Frank," she whispered. Ray didn't know who Frank was. He grabbed the coil of rope from the bottom of the boat and worked one end under her arms. Her body was so cold it felt like touching wet stone. Her coat was heavy with water, and her legs were still trapped under the log at an angle he couldn't see. He tried to lift her by the rope, and she made a small, sharp sound like a puppy that had been stepped on, and he stopped. "Ribs," she whispered. "Okay," Ray said. "Okay, Ma'am." He grabbed the handheld VHF and keyed it. "Wendell," he said, and his voice cracked. "Wendell, come in." "I hear you, Ray." Wendell's voice came back at once. "I got Dorothy Ames in the cattails on the East Bank," Ray said. "She's alive. Call the fire station. Tell them to bring the boat and a stretcher. She's been in the water. Tell them cold water. 5 days, maybe. Ribs are broken." There was 1 second of static. Then Wendell said, "I'm calling right now," and the radio went dead. Ray put the radio down. He looked at Dorothy. He put his hand on the side of her face. Her skin was so cold it almost burned him. "Ma'am," he said, "help is coming. You hang on with me. What's your name, honey?" "Dorothy," she whispered. "Dorothy," Ray said. "Dorothy, I need you to keep your eyes open. Can you do that for me?" She opened her eyes. She looked at him for the first time. Something small and human came back into her face. "You heard her," she said. "I heard her," Ray said. His throat closed up. "She's a good dog, Dorothy." "She's the best dog," Dorothy said. Ray reached down into the water and worked, slow and careful, to figure out what was holding her legs. The submerged log was wedged against the clay bank in a way that had made a kind of pocket, and Dorothy's right thigh was pinned in the pocket by the pressure of the current itself. If he tried to pull her straight up, he was going to break her leg or crush her chest, or both. He needed the log to move. He got out of the boat. The water hit him at the waist, and it was so cold his knees buckled. He caught himself on the boat and steadied. He waded around behind the log. He put his shoulder against it, planted his feet in the mud, and pushed. The log shifted maybe an inch. He pushed again. It shifted 2 more inches. Dorothy made a small sound in her throat. "I know," Ray said. "I know, honey. Just a little more." He pushed a 3rd time, and the log turned. Dorothy's leg came free. She gasped and started to slip sideways, and Ray grabbed her under the arms and held her against him. She weighed almost nothing. Her whole body was shivering now in a way that scared him, a hard, rattling shiver that came from deep inside her. "I'm going to lift you into the boat," he said. 1, 2... He lifted her. She screamed, a small, dry scream, and then went limp against him. He laid her in the bottom of the aluminum boat as gently as he could and pulled his coat off and covered her with it. Her right hand was still clenched around the little metal box. He heard the sirens then, faint and far, coming up from town. He got back in the boat and started the motor and nosed the bow out through the cattails toward the open water. Rosie was on the bank across the river. When she saw Ray coming out with Dorothy in the bottom of the boat, she made a sound Ray had never heard a dog make before, a high, thin whimper that broke into a howl and then broke back into a whimper, and she paced back and forth in the mud and pointed her muzzle at the boat and did not take her eyes off it once. Ray brought the boat to the west bank because that was where the road and the sirens were. 2 firefighters and a paramedic named Kevin Estrada waded out and lifted Dorothy onto a stretcher. Kevin took one look at her and started barking orders. "Get the warm blankets," he said. "Get the IV bag warmed up. Move, move, move." Ray stood in the water with his hands hanging useless at his sides and watched them load Dorothy into the ambulance. Just before they closed the doors, he stepped forward. "Her dog," he said. "Her dog is across the river." Kevin looked up. "Somebody go get the dog," he said to nobody in particular, and one of the firefighters, a big red-bearded man named Cal Meacham, nodded once and headed for the boat. The ambulance drove away. Ray stood on the bank with his soaked pants and his shaking hands and watched Cal Meacham cross the river in the aluminum boat and pull up onto the mud where Rosie was standing. Rosie didn't run from him. She let him pick her up. He set her in the boat and she sat in the bow, upright, ears forward, and rowed back across the river to Ray. When the boat touched the bank, she jumped out and ran to Ray and pressed her whole body against his leg and stood there shaking. Ray got down on one knee. He put his arms around her. He put his face in the coarse fur of her neck. She smelled of river mud and old rain and dog. He held her for a long time without moving. "Good girl," he said when he could talk. "Oh, honey, you good, good girl." That was on the 5th morning. Dorothy Ames was in the intensive care unit at Mercy Memorial Hospital in the county seat for 2 full days before the doctors moved her to a regular room. She had 2 cracked ribs, mild hypothermia that had come very close to being not so mild hypothermia, dehydration, and a hairline fracture in her left ankle. They had missed the first time because everything else was worse. She had a saline drip in her left arm and an oxygen tube under her nose and a heart monitor beeping steady and slow on a little stand by her head. Her daughter Susan drove up from Richmond the same evening Ray pulled her mother out of the reeds. Susan was 54 years old, with her mother's ash-colored hair going grey at the temples and her father's steady grey eyes. She stood in the doorway of the intensive care unit for almost a full minute before she could walk in, and when she did walk in, she sat down in the chair next to the bed and put her forehead against her mother's cold hand and cried without making any sound at all. Dorothy was asleep. She slept most of the first 2 days. When she woke up, she was confused, and Susan had to explain to her 3 times where she was and what had happened, and each time Dorothy's face crumpled a little, and she said, "Rosie, where is Rosie?" Rosie was in the yard behind Ray Calloway's brown-shingled cottage on the west side of the river. Ray had taken her home in the boat that first afternoon. He had rinsed the mud off her with the garden hose. He had opened a can of chicken soup and poured it in a bowl and set it on the kitchen floor, and she had eaten it in 11 seconds. He had opened a second can. She had eaten that one too. He had filled the water dish, and she had drunk it dry, and he had filled it again. That night, Rosie slept on the braided rag rug next to Ray's bed, where Buddy used to sleep. Ray lay in the dark on his back, with his hands folded on his chest, and listened to her breathe. He had not heard a dog breathing in his bedroom since April. He had not realized until that moment how much silence he had been living in. On the morning of the 3rd day, Ray drove to Mercy Memorial with a plastic grocery bag on the passenger seat that had in it Dorothy's cell phone, which he had found on her back porch on a small table, and a photograph of Rosie he had taken in his yard. He had printed the photograph at the drugstore on the way. Rosie was sitting up straight in the picture with her ears forward and one paw slightly raised, and she looked very serious and very alive. Dorothy was awake when he walked in. Susan was in the chair by the bed. Susan stood up when she saw him and put her hand on his arm and did not say anything for a moment. "You," she finally said. "You're Ray." "I'm Ray," he said. Susan hugged him. She was not a big woman, but she hugged him hard, and Ray stood with his arms not quite sure where to go, and eventually put them around her back and patted her once, twice, awkwardly. "Thank you," Susan said. "Mr. Calloway, thank you." Ray started, and then he stopped because he did not know what to say. "I'm just glad," he said. "I'm just glad." Dorothy in the bed said, "Come here, young man." Ray walked over. She reached up with the hand that didn't have the IV and closed her fingers around his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Where is she?" Dorothy said. "She's at my house," Ray said. "She's eaten about 3 cans of soup and half a bag of dog food. She slept next to my bed last night. She's fine, Mom. She's more than fine." Dorothy closed her eyes for a moment. A tear ran out from under one eyelid and down into her hair. "Thank you," she said. "I brought a picture," Ray said. He put the photograph on the little rolling tray by her bed. Dorothy opened her eyes and looked at it and touched it with one finger. "She waited," Dorothy said. "She kept waiting." "Yes, Ma'am," Ray said. "She sure did." Ray sat down in the chair Susan had pulled over for him. Susan went out to get coffee. For a little while, Ray and Dorothy sat in the quiet and just looked at each other. Then Dorothy said in a small, clear voice, "What made you finally stop and look, Mr. Calloway?" Ray sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded and thought about that. He thought about Buddy and the vet's office and the 4 hours in the dark kitchen. He thought about Rosie's voice cracking in her throat on the 4th morning. He thought about the way he had almost turned the boat around in the cattails. "I don't know," he said. "I sure don't. I watched that dog one morning and I figured, well, nobody cries that hard at nothing." Dorothy nodded slowly and did not say anything more, but Susan came back with the coffee and she and Ray sat by the bed and talked, quietly, so as not to wake Dorothy when she drifted off. Susan asked Ray about himself, and Ray told her about the electric company and about Nora leaving him in '92 and about Buddy dying in April. Susan listened. She was a good listener. At some point, Ray realized he had told her more about himself in 20 minutes than he had told anyone in about 20 years. And he felt embarrassed and stopped talking, and Susan smiled at him with tired eyes and said, "It's all right, Ray. Talk as much as you want." The next morning, back in Millhaven, the story was already going around town. Doris Cutler, from 3 houses down, came to Dorothy's front porch with a casserole in her arms and stood on the mat and cried out loud into her own scarf. And then she took the casserole home again because Dorothy wasn't there to eat it, and then she brought a different casserole to Ray Calloway's house. Because Ray was keeping Dorothy's dog, and Doris wanted to do something to say sorry for not calling Susan on Friday when she had thought about it. Ray took the casserole and set it on the kitchen counter and did not know what to do with it, because he had not eaten a casserole made by anyone but himself in over 30 years. Rosie sat by his feet and stared up at the counter. He ended up scooping a spoonful into her bowl. She inhaled it. He ate the rest for supper. The story kept going around town. Wendell Pierce told it at the hardware store. Cal Meacham, the firefighter, told it at the diner. The substitute mail carrier told it at church. By Sunday, everybody in Millhaven had heard how a brown and white hound named Rosie had stood on the muddy bank of the river for 5 mornings and cried loud enough to save her person, and how Ray Calloway, retired electrician and widower of a dog, had finally listened. That was when the first twist came. On Monday morning, Ray got a phone call. It was Susan. "Ray," she said, "I need you to come to the hospital. It's not about Mom. Mom is doing better. It's something else." "I'll come now," Ray said. He drove to the hospital with Rosie in the passenger seat of his truck because he did not want to leave her home alone, and because he was starting to admit to himself that he did not want to leave her at all. When he got there, Susan was standing in the hallway outside Dorothy's room, and she was holding a small brown envelope in her hand. "She wants to tell you herself," Susan said. "Come in." Dorothy was sitting up. She looked better. Her color had come back. She had a cup of ice chips on the tray in front of her and a hospital gown that was too big for her thin shoulders. "Sit down, Ray," she said. Ray sat. "Ray," Dorothy said, "the tin box I had in my hand when you found me, do you know what was in it?" "No, ma'am," Ray said. "I never opened it." "It was my husband's wedding ring," Dorothy said. "Frank died 4 years ago. Before he died, he asked me to put his ring in the river. I was on my way to do that when I fell." Ray was quiet for a second. "Mom," he said, "I'm real sorry." "Well," Dorothy said. She looked down at her hands, which were still very thin and very pale. "That's the first thing. The second thing is what Susan is holding." "Susan, honey." Susan opened the envelope and took out a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. It was a piece of yellow legal paper, written on in an old man's careful hand. "My mother had my father's will and my father's ring in a safe in the bedroom," Susan said. "We got them out this weekend so Mom could see them, and there was this letter in the safe with the ring. It was addressed to my mother, sealed. She'd never opened it. She didn't know it was there." Dorothy said, "Frank wrote it the week before he died. He knew I'd be alone, I guess. He never told me he was writing it. I found it this weekend for the first time." Ray sat still. "In the letter," Dorothy said, "Frank said a lot of things, but the thing he said that I want to tell you about is Rosie. He told me in the letter that when he'd trained Rosie, he'd trained her to do one thing he'd never showed me. He'd taught her, if I ever went out for a walk and didn't come home, to go to the river. He'd been a hunting dog trainer for 40 years, Mr. Calloway. He knew that if she went home, nobody would be there. He knew if she went to the river, somebody would eventually be there." Ray sat very still. "She was doing what he told her," Dorothy said. "Every morning. She was doing exactly what he told her." Ray put his hand over his mouth. He felt his eyes fill up. He did not want to cry in front of these two women. He held his hand there for a while. "Good Lord," he said, muffled through his fingers. "Yes," Dorothy said gently. Ray took his hand down. "He must have loved you a whole lot," he said, "to think of a thing like that." "He did," Dorothy said. "He absolutely did." Ray looked at his hands. "Ma'am," he said, "if you'll let me, when you get out of here, I'd like to help you take that ring to the river." Dorothy smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it was a real one. "I would like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." Ray drove home that afternoon with Rosie in the passenger seat and did not know what to think. He kept looking over at the dog. Rosie looked back at him steadily, ears forward, and he had the strong, sudden feeling that Frank Ames, whoever he had been, was somewhere very close by and was watching all of this with quiet satisfaction. That night, Ray sat at his kitchen table with a beer he wasn't drinking and thought about the last 6 months. He thought about April. He thought about how, the day after Buddy died, he had gone to the shelter to ask a stupid question about paperwork and had seen a whole row of kennels full of dogs who needed homes, and how he had walked out of that shelter as fast as he could walk without running, because the thought of loving another dog had felt to him like the worst kind of betrayal. He thought about all the mornings since then that he had walked past Rosie without stopping. He thought about how he had almost turned the boat around in the cattails. He drank the beer. He went to bed. Rosie slept on the rug next to him. 2 days later, on Wednesday morning of that week, Dorothy Ames was released from the hospital. Susan drove her home to Sycamore Lane in a rental car. Ray followed in his truck with Rosie in the passenger seat. When they pulled into the driveway of the pale yellow house, there were 16 people standing on the front lawn. Doris Cutler, Wendell Pierce, Cal Meacham, the firefighter in his uniform, the substitute mail carrier, the pastor of the Methodist Church, kids from the elementary school with a hand-painted sign that said, "Welcome home, Miss Dorothy." Every one of them was clapping. Dorothy sat in the passenger seat of the rental car and cried. Susan got out and opened the door for her, and Doris Cutler came forward with a wheelchair somebody had brought from the church basement, and they wheeled Dorothy across her own front yard while the neighbors clapped. When Ray opened the passenger door of his truck, Rosie jumped out and ran across the lawn and put her front paws on Dorothy's lap and licked her face and made a small crying sound in her throat, and Dorothy put both hands on the dog's ears and pressed her forehead against Rosie's forehead and stayed like that for a long time. Ray stood at the edge of the crowd and watched. He was a man who did not like crowds. He was a man who did not like scenes. But he stood there and watched, and he did not go home. That was on the 7th day after the rescue. But this story is not over yet. There was one more thing that needed to happen. There was one more twist. It came on the following Saturday, 3 days after Dorothy came home. Ray drove over to Sycamore Lane in the morning to check on her. Susan had gone back to Richmond for the work week and would be back on Friday nights until Dorothy was steady on her feet again. Doris Cutler was coming over 3 times a day to help with meals. Ray had decided, without exactly deciding, to walk over every morning before breakfast to sit on the front porch with Dorothy and drink a cup of coffee. That Saturday he brought Rosie with him. He had been keeping Rosie at his place because Dorothy could not yet manage the stairs to the yard alone and needed help letting the dog in and out. But that morning, he thought maybe Dorothy would like to have Rosie back for a few hours. He put Rosie on a leash and walked her the 1.5 miles through town. When he got to Sycamore Lane, Dorothy was not on the porch. Ray stood at the bottom of the steps for a second. He looked at his watch. It was 8:10. Dorothy was usually on the porch by 7:30. He walked up the steps and knocked on the front door. Nobody answered. He knocked again. Rosie sat down on the porch mat and stared at the door. Ray's stomach went cold. He tried the door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open. "Dorothy?" he called. No answer. He walked into the front hall. The house was quiet. The kitchen was empty. The little front room where Frank had died was empty. The bathroom door at the end of the hall was closed. Ray walked down the hall. "Dorothy?" he said, and knocked on the bathroom door. "Dorothy, are you in there?" There was a long pause. Then Dorothy's voice, small and shaky, said, "Ray, I fell. I fell, Ray. I can't get up." Ray went cold all over. He pushed the bathroom door open. Dorothy was on the tile floor between the toilet and the sink. She was in a nightgown and a bathrobe and one slipper. Her walker was tipped over on top of her. Her cheek was against the tile and she was shaking a little. "I got you," Ray said, and he was down on the tile with her in 1 second, moving the walker off her, lifting her by her shoulders. "I got you, honey. Come here now. Easy." She was not hurt. That was the thing Ray understood as he lifted her. She had slipped on the bath mat, her ankle had given out, and she had gone down slow enough not to break anything. She was not hurt, but she was shaking hard, and she was crying, and when he got her up on the closed lid of the toilet and knelt in front of her, holding her hands, she looked at him and said, "I've been on that floor for an hour, Ray. Nobody would have found me." Ray held her hands. "Well," he said quietly, "I found you now." "Nobody would have found me," Dorothy said again. Ray thought about the river. He thought about the cattails. He thought about the 5 days she had lain in the water thinking she was going to die alone. He thought about all the years since Frank had died that she had lived by herself in this pale yellow house at the end of Sycamore Lane, and about all the morning she had made coffee at the kitchen window with nobody to say good morning to, except a dog. He thought about his own kitchen. "Dorothy," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it. I know we haven't known each other real long, but I want you to think about it anyway." She looked at him. "I got a spare bedroom," Ray said. "It's a nice big one on the ground floor, bathroom right next to it. My kitchen looks out at a good tree. I got a fence around the yard for Rosie, and I got no wife and no kids, and my dog died in April, and I've been rattling around in that cottage by myself for a long time. What I want to ask you is if you would consider coming to stay with me. Not like that, as friends. So you don't have to be alone in this house anymore, and so I don't have to eat supper by myself every night." Dorothy stared at him. Her eyes filled up. "Ray Calloway." She said, "I've known you for 11 days. "I know it," Ray said. "That's why I said think about it. Take your time." Dorothy laughed. It was a small, crying laugh. She reached out and put her cold hand on his cheek, the way you might touch a boy who had just done something surprising. "I'll think about it," she said. "I will." Rosie was sitting in the bathroom doorway. She had not moved since Ray had pushed the door open. She was watching them both, ears forward, eyes bright. That was the first Saturday. Dorothy took a whole week to think about it. She talked to Susan. Susan drove up from Richmond that Friday night and sat at the kitchen table with her mother and Ray, and the three of them talked for 2 hours and drank 3 pots of coffee. Susan asked Ray a lot of questions. Ray answered all of them honestly. When Susan and Dorothy went into the front room to talk in private, Ray sat at the kitchen table with Rosie's chin on his knee and waited. Susan came back into the kitchen after 20 minutes. She sat down across from Ray and looked at him with her steady grey eyes. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "my mother is a stubborn woman. She has told me many times she will never leave that yellow house. She has told me that when she dies, she wants to die in the bedroom where my father died, and not 1 minute before her time. She is telling me tonight, for the first time in 4 years, that maybe she is ready to go somewhere else." Ray was quiet. "You are a good man," Susan said. "I can see that. My mother sees it too. If she comes to live with you, I want it clear between us that I am going to come up every month and check, and that I am going to be part of her life from now on in a way that I haven't been, because 5 days in a river should have never happened, and it happened because I was not paying attention." "Yes, Mom," Ray said. "And I want you to know," Susan said, "that whatever happens, whatever she decides, you and Rosie are welcome in my mother's life for as long as she has one." "Yes, Mom," Ray said. Susan nodded once. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Mom," she called into the front room, "come tell him what you decided." Dorothy came into the kitchen. She sat down at the table. She reached across and took Ray's hand. "Ray," she said, "I'd like to come and stay." Ray held her hand for a moment. Then he did something he had not done in 20 years. He smiled with his whole face at once. "I would be honored," he said. That night, back at the brown-shingled cottage, Ray lay on his back in the dark bedroom and could not sleep. Rosie was on the rug next to him, breathing slow and steady. Ray put one hand over the edge of the mattress and let it rest on the coarse fur of the dog's back. Rosie let out a long, soft breath and did not move. "You changed everything," Ray said quietly. "You know that, girl. You changed everything." Rosie thumped her tail once against the rug. Ray was quiet for a long time. Then, into the darkness above his bed, in a voice so low nobody but a dog could have heard it, he said, "Buddy, I miss you, buddy. I hope you don't mind." The rug on the floor made a small rustling sound. Rosie shifted, stretched, and rested her chin on the toe of Ray's foot. Ray closed his eyes. It took 2 weeks to move Dorothy in. Doris Cutler, and 3 other women from the church helped pack her clothes and her photographs and her good china, and the framed picture of Frank in his army uniform from 1962. Susan drove up on a Saturday with a rental truck. Ray cleaned out the spare bedroom in the brown-shingled cottage and painted it a soft, pale yellow, because he had noticed that Dorothy's house was that color, and he thought she might like waking up to a similar color in a new place. He bought a new bedspread at the department store. He bought a small vase and a dish for the dresser. He was terrified he would get some detail wrong. When Dorothy walked into the room for the first time, she stopped in the doorway. She looked at the yellow walls. She looked at the vase. She looked at the picture of Frank he had put on the dresser in a new frame. She did not say anything for a while. "You did all this," she finally said. "I wanted you to be comfortable," Ray said. Dorothy walked slowly across the room, put her hand on the yellow wall, and stood there with her palm flat against it and her eyes closed. "Frank would have loved this house," she said. Ray did not know what to say to that, so he did not say anything. That night, the 3 of them, Ray and Dorothy and Rosie, ate supper together at the little kitchen table in the brown-shingled cottage. Ray had made pot roast because it was the only company meal he knew how to make. Rosie sat under the table and put her head across Dorothy's foot. Nobody said very much. Nobody needed to. Autumn deepened. The leaves on the big maple in Ray's front yard went yellow and then orange, and then red, and then began to fall. Dorothy's ribs healed. Her ankle healed. She got her strength back slowly, week by week. She began in November to walk to the mailbox by herself. In December, she walked to the end of the block and back with Rosie on the leash. In January, there was snow, and she stayed inside, and she and Ray played rummy at the kitchen table in the evenings, and Rosie slept between their feet. Susan drove up from Richmond every 3rd Saturday. She brought her 2 teenagers, a boy of 16 named Ethan, and a girl of 14 named Grace, and the 4 of them would eat lunch at Ray's kitchen table and then walk over to the county park to throw a tennis ball for Rosie. Grace was quiet and shy and took a long time to warm up to Ray. But by Christmas, she was calling him Uncle Ray without being told to. Ray did not know what to do with a name like that. He kept it anyway. In March, the snow melted, and the river came up and receded, and the redbuds began to bloom along the county road. Dorothy said one morning at the kitchen table with a piece of toast in her hand, "Ray, I think it's time." "Time for what?" Ray said. "The ring," she said. "I want to take it to the river." Ray put down his coffee cup. "I'll get the truck," he said. They drove out to the county access on a Saturday afternoon in the last week of March. The trees were budding. The river was high and clear and cold. Ray backed Wendell's aluminum boat, which Wendell had told him to keep on permanent loan, because some boats know their owners, down the ramp, and Dorothy climbed in with Ray's hand under her elbow. Rosie jumped in on her own and sat in the bow with her ears forward. Susan and Ethan and Grace were on the bank with Doris Cutler and Pastor Halstead and Wendell Pierce and 4 other people from Millhaven who had asked respectfully if they could come. Ray started the motor and nosed the boat upstream. He guided it, slow and steady, past the fallen willow and the bend and up along the east bank until they were opposite the tangle of cattails where he had found her in October. He cut the motor. The boat drifted. Dorothy took the tin box out of her coat pocket. It was the same box she had been holding when Ray had pulled her out of the water. Inside was the ring, a plain silver band, worn thin on the inside from 49 years of wear. She held it in her palm for a long moment and looked at it. Then she looked at Rosie, sitting in the bow of the boat. "Rosie," she said, "your daddy trained you well." Rosie thumped her tail against the aluminum. Dorothy closed her fingers around the ring. She leaned over the side of the boat. She whispered something Ray did not hear and was not meant to hear. Then she opened her fingers, and the ring fell, and it caught the afternoon light for one bright second, and then it slipped into the water and disappeared into the current. Dorothy sat back. She let out a long, long breath. Ray reached over and took her hand. "He's got it now, Dorothy," he said. "He's got it." Dorothy nodded. She could not talk for a minute. Then she said, "Take me home, Ray." Ray started the motor. He turned the boat downstream. Rosie stood up in the bow with her ears forward and the wind in her face. On the bank, the small crowd of people from Millhaven watched them come in, and Doris Cutler waved a handkerchief, and Pastor Halstead put his hat over his heart, and Susan stood with one arm around each of her children and cried in the good way that people cry when a story ends the way it was supposed to. That could have been the end, but it wasn't quite. 3 weeks after they took the ring to the river, on a warm April morning, Ray Calloway drove to the county animal shelter alone. He walked in through the glass door and stood at the front desk with his cap in his hands. A young woman with a name tag that said Erin was behind the desk. She looked up and smiled at him. "I was in here just about a year ago," Ray said. "I asked a stupid question about paperwork for a dog that had passed. I walked out before I looked at any of the dogs. I've been thinking about that for a while now. I thought maybe today I'd look." Erin's face softened. "I'd be glad to walk you through," she said. She took him down the long fluorescent hall where the kennels ran along one wall, 24 of them, and about half of them had a dog in them. Ray walked slow. He looked at every one. There were pit mixes and lab mixes and one shepherd and 2 hounds and a small brown terrier that put its paws up on the kennel door and stared at him with eyes that were too old for its body. "This one," Ray said, and stopped. The kennel card said the dog was about 10 years old. Owner surrender, female, name unknown. She had been at the shelter for 4 months. "She's a sweet girl," Erin said. "She's just old. People don't adopt old dogs." "I'm an old dog too," Ray said. "Get me the paperwork." He drove home that afternoon with the brown terrier riding in the passenger seat with her head on his knee. Rosie was on the front porch when he pulled into the drive. She stood up and stared at the truck. Ray opened the passenger door and lifted the little terrier down. Rosie walked over slow, sniffed her all the way around, and then licked her ear once and turned around and led her up the porch steps and into the house. Dorothy was in the kitchen. She looked at the little brown dog. She looked at Ray. She started laughing and crying at the same time. "What is her name?" Dorothy said. "I thought maybe you could pick one," Ray said. Dorothy sat down at the kitchen table and put her chin in her hand and looked at the little terrier for a long time. The terrier put her chin on the toe of Dorothy's slipper. "Hope," Dorothy said. "I think her name is Hope." Ray smiled. "Hope it is," he said. The 4 of them ate supper together that night in the brown shingled cottage on the west side of the Millhaven River. Dorothy said grace. She thanked God for the food and for the roof and for the second chance and for the 2 good dogs on the floor. She did not thank God for Ray directly, but she reached across the table and squeezed his hand when she said Amen, and Ray understood what she meant. Later that night, Ray took Rosie out into the backyard. It was almost dark. The last of the light was purple on the horizon, the same color the sky had been the evening Dorothy went to the river with the ring. Ray stood on the back step with his hands in his pockets and watched Rosie trot across the grass and stop and lift her head and stare toward the east, toward the river, the way she had stared for 5 mornings from a muddy bank. She was not barking now. She was just looking. Ray thought about all the mornings he had walked past her without stopping. He thought about Buddy on the kitchen floor. He thought about Nora in 1992 and how many years he had spent believing he was better off alone. He thought about a woman he had known for 6 months who was standing at his kitchen window right now, washing supper dishes, and about a little brown terrier asleep on the rug by the door, and about the wedding ring of a man he had never met resting somewhere at the bottom of a slow bend in the river. He thought about the fact that a dog had cried loud enough to be heard across 40 yards of open water for 4 mornings before he had listened. He whistled softly. Rosie's ears came up. She turned and trotted back across the yard to him, up the step, past his knees, into the warm kitchen where Dorothy stood at the sink. "Come on inside, girl," Ray said. "Come on inside." He closed the door behind them. And that, more or less, is the story of a brown and white hound named Rosie, and a woman named Dorothy who fell into a river at dusk, and a man named Ray Calloway who almost did not look. It's the story of a dog who did what she had been quietly taught to do by a man who was no longer alive to see it done. It's the story of 11 mornings and 1 cold pocket of a river, and the small, terrible way that a whole town can miss a thing that is happening right in front of it. But mostly, it's the story of what happens when somebody finally stops walking and turns their head and looks. If this story moved you, take a second right now to like the video and to leave a comment down below. Tell me about a dog in your life who understood you better than any person ever did. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like this one coming, and I would love to have you here for them. Thank you for listening, and take care of each other and take care of your dogs. They're always trying to tell us something. All we have to do is stop and listen.